Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. For anybody who has joined us before, welcome back. And for anybody who's joining us for the first time, welcome. Hopefully this will be the first of many. So today, we're obviously talking about AI governance, vulnerabilities, and visibility. I have three of my colleagues on with me today, three experts, let me say. We've got Chris, Callum and Harry, who are going to cover the three areas that we've talked about across the webinar. So we're going to start with the most exciting bit, the AI governance. We're going to then move on to security testing in the new world of AI and LLMs. And then we're going to talk about AI visibility and monitoring across organizations to see what employees are inputting and things like that. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Chris.
Right, so hopefully, good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully everybody can see that screen. If you can't see it, it says AI policy and governance. Just shout, but I think we should be in a position to get going. So thank you, Laura, for bigging up governance. I know it is the most exciting part of security, but it's a very important part, obviously, of what we do. So my background, as I said, head of consultancy within DigitalXRAID. So I've been, I guess, knocking around the industry now for nearly 30 years in various forms, from sort of network architecture and design and network management and pre-sales and all kinds of areas of consultancy. And so it's a sort of natural progression, really, that the world of AI has sort of arrived into the sort of governance, risk and compliance world, which is what we're trying and cover today. So let me just move my slide on. So what are we looking at? So it's really, I think, a question, and I suspect many people on the call today are in this kind of position at the moment, which is trying to understand, whether or not you need a policy, what's driving this, the regulatory requirements, and if you do need a policy, what you're going to put in it, and then how you're going to align it to some of the other governance standards that I'm sure you all know and love, and particularly if you've done or in the process of doing something like ISO 27001, then again, some of this will be quite familiar to you, because they say the latest standards are obviously written in a similar fashion. So that's really what it is. So it's really to try and give people a bit of a primer on where they should be, what they're looking at, and in terms of practical implementation and the way forward, really, for AI in the world. So I think what we'll do is we'll crack on and we'll make a start. So why does your organization need a policy? I think those statistics probably speak for themselves. I think, again, probably most people on this call will be aware or suddenly or very acutely aware of how quickly artificial intelligence in its various guises has sort of come into our lives. ChatGPT is barely three and a half years old, thereabouts, and the pace of change is like nothing that I've ever seen in the industry, certainly in my experience, and the speed at which it's changing. You're sort of talking months rather than years in terms of implementation. So that makes our lives very difficult. And clearly, what is also happening is that our employees are already using these tools, and that's the danger as well, because sometimes it's not necessarily maliciously, but understanding how they're using the tools and what tools they're actually using, and what they're putting into the tools in terms of the sort of personal or private data that you might be holding as clients. That is a bit of a sort of governance nightmare that anybody involved in that space will be sort of waking up in cold sweats in the night, because they say there's a potential for an awful lot of sort of data breaches to come from the use of the inadvertent use of these tools. So this is the sort of scenario we're working in, and what we're trying to do is, I think, avoid the potential reputational damage that obviously the use of AI, again in good faith, may also cause you. So there's I think the view is here is that if you're not aware of what your staff are already using, then it's very difficult to write a policy, and it's very difficult to come up with a way of protecting your company and protecting your employees from what they're doing. So and on the back of what we used to refer to as sort of shadow IT, there's now a sort of shadow AI, if you like, and people are using it because they feel it makes them more productive, which may well be the case, and actually is something that you probably want to encourage. But without the sort of formal approval, the risk assessment approaches that we're familiar with in other areas of IT and IT security, you're creating a bit of a blind spot in your security program, and that's a potential risk as well. So this is really where we're coming from in the current space. Now, what we are seeing, there's also some regulatory change, which, in fairness to the regulators, they're actually getting ahead of the game a little bit here. And, the EU has been working on a fairly major artificial intelligence act for a number of years now. And also, we have a number of existing controls and laws that may have some impact on what you're doing with these tools. And the ICO has been very vocal here in putting out some information around the use of AI, and how the controls that we have through GDPR, whether it's the EU or UK version, that those controls exist for AI as well. And so how you use an AI tool, that is already covered by GDPR. So you've got to be aware of these things, because that's possibly creating a breach scenario that you're going to have to cope with. And there are also, again, if you're in specific sectors, it mentions FCA here, but again, the other one probably is healthcare. You're going to have some other drivers there, particularly around data protection and personal data or sensitive personal data being used in these tools. So it's a developing area, and it's something that you would be well versed to keep an eye on, because, as I said, because of the pace of change, it's likely that these regulatory controls will be updated as well. And the other area, and it's worth highlighting at the bottom there, director liability. So some of the rule changes that are coming in, and we're seeing it in things like the new Cybersecurity Resilience Act, or bill as it currently is, but going through Parliament at the moment. There's a drive towards personal liability for some of this stuff as well. So again, it's going to pay for you to be aware of what's being used and how it's being used within your company, so that you can understand the risks that you're potentially facing. And that's really what it comes down to, again. The sort of driving nature of all of these standards, and everything we do really in security is risk, and it's no different for AI from any other tool in that sense. So from looking at a policy and what you want to do, well, I think it sort of splits itself up quite nicely into the following sections. Again, I don't think there's anything particularly surprising here. Scoping is key. Understanding the tools that are in use, what actually constitutes AI and what you're trying to do with it, understanding where your teams are using it. I think in terms of putting the policy together, you're going to have to spend some time with your teams internally. You're going to have to do some research with your teams, and you're going to probably have to have some sort of amnesty in place as well, because what you don't want people doing is hiding their use, and then them potentially fearing, if they've been using the tool and they shouldn't have been, that there's going to be some sort of comeback on them as individuals. The worst thing that you can have is not knowing what's being used. So that's probably something to consider as well, to understand, to make people aware that they're not going to get into trouble for telling you what they've done, but you need to have a good idea of what your scope is going to be before you can put the policy together. And then from there, you can then build a list of approved uses, and more importantly, what's prohibited in terms of what you put into the engines and what data you can put into it. And then you've got to work it into your existing data classification rules, and this is where it starts to sort of cross over with what you've done perhaps in ISO 27001. And then similarly, you need a process for how your staff get approval to use these tools. The view that the sort of old-fashioned view of IT being the sort of department of no and not allowing people to do things really doesn't work in AI, and you're much better having a position that says yes, you can use it, but you do it like this, and these are the controls that you put in place, and these are the boundaries that you have to respect. It's a much better approach rather than just saying you can't use it, because bans rarely work, and people will find ways around bans. So it's really a case of embracing what it's giving you, but understanding what the risks are and understanding what the limitations are of AI at the moment. And then finally, it's really about, I say, the accountability side of it. In the sense, similar way to 27001, the standards really require the sort of directors and your senior executives to be aware and accountable for how you're using AI. So it's a similar process to what you should have been going through with your policy set for all the other areas that your company tends to deal with on a daily basis. So that's really, I think, the approach. I think if you've done any kind of policy development in the past, those steps won't be particularly surprising. It's just focusing around the areas of artificial intelligence. And then also, obviously, one of the reasons we're here today, ISO 42001, as it says, is the first international standard for AI management systems, which is good, and it also shows how the sort of standards organizations are reflecting the world and how quickly they've moved. Again, if you've been in the ISO world for any length of time, you'll know the process that they go through to create these standards, and it takes forever to go through the various groups and the various working groups that put these standards together and to make sure that they're okay. But they have moved by ISO standards very quickly to get this out, as a usable standard, which is good, and but it also reflects how quickly the world is changing. But in terms of, the coverage, if you're already doing 27001 or you're in the process of doing certification to the standard, then I think the good news is that a lot of what you're doing in that will then be directly attributable to 42000 well. And as I say, our view is that it's somewhere between 40 to 60% of the way there already if you're doing 27001. So again, if you're familiar with the ISO standards, they're all written in the same fashion. They have the same headings, they have the same process. So they've done, and again, the AI management system is very similar, but of course it obviously goes that step further by addressing the actual specific risks associated with AI rather than it being sort of just treating it as another information asset. It's actually going in a bit deeper and looking at how it works, how the roles are defined, and how your policy should work as well. And it also does certain elements looking at third parties and the use of third-party tools as well. So it's a pretty comprehensive approach. As I said, I think the key difference between 27001 and 42001 is the way that AI is treated. It's with 42001, it's looking much more at the whole cycle. So it's the development, the deployment, and then the use of the system. And that's the difference. Whereas in 27001, it's more of a sort of generic information asset. So there is a difference, as you'd expect, because obviously it's focused around AI, but it does fit in quite nicely with the 27001 world as well. So that seems to be the way forward. It's very achievable in terms of a standard. I mean, as I said, I think most organizations will probably look at it to complement their 27001 environment. You can approach it as a separate standalone ISO qualification. That's absolutely fine, but I suspect most organizations will probably already have or be considering 27001 as an information security management system, and this will be part of it. And that's really, I think, the best approach that you should do. And then in terms of the requirements, well, I think as we talked about before, I think clause 4 is very important. Again, it's understanding the context and also the requirements of your stakeholders, and really exploring the sort of ethical side of using artificial intelligence and whether or not it's appropriate for your business. That's going to be very key. As we mentioned before, on the leadership side, it requires a sort of top-down approach whereby you get the buy-in from your directors and senior executives, and then it's supported down throughout your company across your teams. And again, that's very similar to 27001, and this should be treated in a very similar fashion. Clause 6 is the risk assessment side. Again, if you're familiar with all the ISO standards, the risk is the core asset, if you like, or the core approach to all of these standards, and it's the core of everything we do, quite frankly. So understanding, identifying specific risks that are associated with AI, that could come down to perhaps the algorithms it's using. There's a certain level of bias that's been seen in some of these models. We've got to look at the quality of the data, whether you've got sort of third-party APIs and other kind of integrations into any of the engines that you're using. They are all going to be potential risks that you need to identify and be aware of. So I don't think this is a small task. I think there's quite a lot to it. I think you can get a policy together at a basic level relatively quickly, but I think, like with most policies, the time is spent in the detail, and the risk assessment side of it is going to be very key to making sure your policy is going to work and be effective for you. Other side of things, of course, looking at monitoring, measurement, use of the system, that's going to be key again. But this is also back to the point that you've got to understand what it is that your staff are using at the moment, and which systems are going to be authorized and which systems aren't, and how you control access to those systems. And then, so that's a very important part of this too. And in the same way that 27001 has a very large Annex A with all the controls in there that you can apply to your environment, there is a specific set of AI controls within 42001 as well. So again, it's a very similar approach to what we've seen in 27001. So as an approach, as I said, I think if you're familiar in the 27001 world, I don't think there'll be anything in here that surprises you. But of course, the key will be understanding the risk that you face, the systems you're using, how it's deployed, and how it's used, and they're going to be the key things that you're going to have to work out for yourselves, really. So in terms of implementation, again, I think it's a fairly practical, fairly standard approach to doing any kind of policy work. You're starting with a foundations, a gap assessment approach to see where you are in terms of understanding what you're currently using and what you want to use and what you want to get out of it. Putting together a starting draft policy, and then working with your stakeholders to finalize what will be your acceptable use around the policy, defining the workflows, and then I think very importantly, doing a lot of training with your staff so that they understand the risks and they understand what they can do and what they can't do, and why it's so important. And I think that this is an area that I think there's going to be a lot of time and effort spent on is in educating your staff as to how best they can use the tools and what they can and can't do with it. And then the other stages are, I think, more traditional policy governance areas that you're probably familiar with, which is looking at developing and maintaining a risk register, privacy impact assessments, looking at suppliers and looking at what they're doing with AI as well. And then making sure you've got a proper management review structure in place. Again, you can add that into your 27001 management review process quite easily, and so that process will be quite familiar if you're doing it. And then really, in terms of if you're going for certification, it's exactly the same process that you will be familiar with 27001, which is effectively an internal audit where you do it yourself or with an independent third party. We do a lot of those kind of internal audits with our client base at the moment. You then do the stage one documentation review, which is a relatively light touch approach, again similar to 27001, and then stage two will take place normally 6 to 12 months after you've done stage one, and again that's a much more detailed independent auditor review, and they will look for the supporting evidence for what you've done with the policy and how you've implemented that. Again, very similar to what you're familiar with 27001. So I think that's the general approach. Again, I don't think that will be particularly surprising or unusual to anybody if you're familiar in the governance world. And then the other things to look at really, as a risk is the core thing. Risk is going to be your sort of the way you define your scope and the way that you define the content of your policy. There are various things you can look at in terms of what they refer to as risk dimensions, but generally for artificial intelligence systems, you're going to be looking at the kind of potential data risk, GDPR type problems with using personal data. You want to understand the content, the quality of the output. It does make mistakes. It's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. There can be bias involved in that. It can hallucinate and make things up. You've got to be aware of all of those kind of things, in particular if you're in maybe say the financial and healthcare markets. That's going to be very key. You need to understand, say, the operational risk side of things and the third-party risk, and also be aware, obviously, as you do with all your policies, what the regulatory impact is of what you're doing and how you're using it. So, again, I don't think anything is particularly unusual if you're familiar, if you're working in the governance world at the moment. But it is going to require a sort of expanded approach to take account of the specific things which are related to artificial intelligence. And we're just moving on. And so that's really, as I said, I think that's my sort of view at the moment of the governance world. In terms of, do you need a policy? Absolutely, yes, you should. And if you're not really looking at it yet, then really you need to start doing that sooner rather than later. As I said, the regulatory world is moving very quickly, and therefore, you're going to need to react at a similar speed. The first line of things, the first things you should be looking at, say, an acceptable use policy. Try and get that in place. That should be relatively easy to define. That can set some boundaries for your staff, and that's the really way forward. And then I think the certifiable approach, looking at 42,000 as an extension to what you're doing with your 27001 ISMS, I think is a very sensible approach. And that will be my way forward. And as I said, I think you're looking at absolute first steps, as we do with many clients when we're doing 27001. It's really doing a gap assessment and really understanding what your current environment is, and then understanding where AI potentially fits into that, and then what you can do with it. And then, as it says at the end there, understanding what your exposure will be. And I think that's my lot. So that hopefully gives you an understanding of where we're looking at it from a governance perspective. So,
thank you. Thanks so much, Chris. I'm happy to hand over now to Callum.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name's Callum Bryant. I'm the Director of Security Testing and Innovation here at DigitalXRAID. So I run and manage the pen testing team, and then also integrate AI within obviously DigitalXRAID, and obviously assess customers as well. So I'm going to walk through with you guys AI and LLM security testing. We'll cover why it matters, what vulnerabilities we're actually seeing in the wild, and how you can integrate AI testing into your kind of existing program, and things to be aware of and things to look out for. So what we'll start off with is, so first of all, why it matters. So let's start off with AI adoption is obviously accelerating rapidly. So when it comes to this, it's a completely new category of security risks. These aren't theoretical anymore. I'm going to share some kind of real world instance, and obviously what you can see from screen, I'll just walk you through what's already happened in this industry of what we've already seen. So back in actually December 2023, a Chevrolet dealership deployed a customer service chatbot. Within hours, someone had it convinced it to agree to sell a vehicle for £1 through prompt injection. So we'll talk about through what that means later on. Let's go through the list. But now, obviously, this particular case, much more embarrassing than costly. But think about what happens when your chatbot actually has authority to process transactions or access sensitive data. So again, prompt injection is a big one, and we've seen it quite frequently. Secondly, Samsung. So they had a bit more of a serious problem back in April. Their employees were using ChatGPT to help with work tasks, which everyone uses. It is obviously great for making you more efficient, debugging code, summarizing meetings, that sort of thing. The issue that they had was that they inadvertently leaked proprietary source code and confidential meeting notes in the process. So Samsung's response, obviously, was to ban ChatGPT entirely across the company. Now, that's quite a drastic measure, but understandable when you don't have proper controls in place, which is where obviously what Chris was talking about comes into place. Air Canada, so third on the list. So back in February of this year, particularly important because it established a legal precedent. So their chatbot gave a customer incorrect information about bereavement fare policies. So when the customer tried to claim the refund, Air Canada argued they shouldn't be held responsible for what their chatbot said. Tribunal disagreed. The company was held legally liable for the AI's mistakes. So that obviously has significant implications for anyone running customers facing AI systems. We all are potentially aware that AI has a history of what we call hallucination. And in this instance, it's obviously cost Air Canada quite dearly. So, and finally on this list, DPD. So their chatbot, again, public-facing one, was manipulated into swearing and criticizing the company. Maybe it's nationally used, as you can probably guess, but again, reputationally, that is not a good thing. And we've seen that publicly as well. Anyone who's used a chatbot AI, if you ask it to do something maybe it shouldn't, is and can produce some quite interesting results. So the most kind of what's important around kind of all of these incidents is that they weren't sophisticated. They're not attacked by kind of APT groups or state level threat actors. These were just regular people having a conversation, discovering that AI systems can obviously be manipulated just generally through simple prompts. And according to some research, up to 73% of organizations have already deployed or are piloting AI solutions. So if you're running AI systems, stuff like customer-facing chatbots, internal tools, low-code or no-code applications, they do need a dedicated security testing program, and they do need to have a lot of governance over them. So what I'll go through next is just the kind of methodologies that are obviously industry best practice. So for those of you that are not aware of OWASP, so that is the Open Web Application Security Project. Now they cover everything from web applications, API, mobile, and obviously now they are covering AI. So we use the OWASP Gen AI LLM Top 10. So again, it's rapidly becoming more standard in the industry, and it's fantastic to kind of get that real baseline for pen testing. So what we're seeing most frequently in real world deployments, now I'm not going to go through every single one of these, otherwise you guys will probably leave, but what I will do is kind of go through some of the ones that I feel definitely and certainly what we see as more of a priority. So we'll start with prompt injection, which is LLM 01. So this definitely sits at number one. So this is where an attacker can craft inputs that override the AI's intended behavior. So like what we said with the previous examples. So for customer service chatbot, this might be extracting confidential information. It might be forcing unauthorized actions or getting it to behave inappropriately, like what we did see with DPD. Sensitive information disclosure. So that's kind of LLM 06 is a big one for both customer facing and internal AI. So we've obviously seen chatbots reveal their system prompts, so which basically exposes exactly what security controls they've implemented and how to bypass them. And we've also seen them leak information from other users' sessions, customer data, internal business processes, anything it's got access to. You can probably find a way to extrapolate that data. Excessive agency is another really big one. So LLM 08. So it's particularly dangerous when you're building AI agents. So if your AI can send emails, access databases, approve requests, anything that's kind of triggered automatically by the AI, what happens when, or certainly what you should be thinking about is what happens when someone tricks it into doing something malicious. So we've had this instance before where we've successfully manipulated AI systems into testing and sending company-wide emails. So excellent when you're thinking about phishing attacks, also approving fake expense reports, granting unauthorized access. And again, this is all through conversation. We're not crafting specific code or using old programming languages. This is just general conversation. And then improper output handling. So that one is not on my list. Can't see that one on there. Oh, there you go. LLM 02. Sorry. So this one's about trusting AI responses without validation. So just because your AI generated something doesn't mean it's safe to act on. So again, like we see on those expenses, previous slides, it's one of those where what it's showing is obviously your responsibility. For business applications, insecure plugin design is critical. So your customer service chatbot probably has CRM access, can look up orders, maybe process refunds. Each of those integrations is a potential attack surface. So very important. Training data poisoning is relevant for organizations using anything to do with RAG. So that's retrieval augmented generation, where the AI pulls from your document repositories. If someone uploads a malicious document to your SharePoint, that AI might read it and start following the attack's embedded instructions. So if you've got something like that in an application that you've got publicly that you would potentially have AI analytics, and you can kind of start doing obviously poisoning of that data. So lastly, but not before we move on, so supply chain vulnerabilities remind us we're often using third-party models. So the question we need to know is, or certainly that we need to be asking, is do you know what security measures your AI vendor has in place? And that's something that we obviously test. So methodology. So our AI penetration testing methodology is designed specifically for AI systems, but it does integrate well with your current testing program. So discovery is where we start, and it's crucial because many organizations don't have complete visibility into their AI components. We found, like Chris said, shadow AI deployments, systems IT didn't even know existed. We found undocumented integrations with third-party LLM APIs. And we need to understand your architecture, what model you're using, what data it can access, what system it connects to, just so we can get a good picture of what we're looking at. Secondly, so threat modeling is where we work with your team to understand what matters most. It is data confidentiality, system availability, brand reputation. A chatbot leaking customer data has different implications than an internal AI agent approving fraudulent transactions. So we prioritize testing based on your specific risk profile. And we can obviously create custom bespoke assessments, i.e. my AI shouldn't be able to do X, Y, Z, and we'll go through and see if we can get it to do those. Active testing, so stage 3, so is where we obviously simulate real attacks. So we'll attempt to extract your system prompts, manipulate the AI into unauthorized actions, exploit plugins, integrations, and test whether your data is isolated between users and obviously other systems. So we want to know, can one user trick the AI into revealing another user's information? And can the AI access more data than it should be allowed to? And can we get back to the original databases, which again, it's not something you want. And then obviously impact assessment. So we don't just report obviously abstract vulnerabilities, but every finding includes detailed demonstration. We show exactly what an attacker could accomplish. We'd obviously provide you with the prompts that we use, show the output, highlight obviously the business risks and the process that we could potentially compromise. And then obviously clear reproduction steps so that your development team know exactly what needs fixing. So providing all of that information helps you kind of replicate what we did. And then finally, remediation guidance, tailored specific to your AI system. So it's not generic security advice, but specific input validation strategies, output sanitization technique, architectural recommendations, and then we'll retest once you implement those fixes, just to make sure they're effective. So attack scenarios. So I'm going to walk you through some of the attack scenarios that my testing team have found and actually exploited. So scenario 1, data exfiltration. So this was incredibly common with customer service chatbots. Organizations build these chatbots with CRM or database access to provide helpful responses. The problem is prompt injection can override those security controls. So obviously from there, what you're able to see is obviously ignore the previous instructions. There's also other stuff that you may have heard if you've been listening about in the news about Dan, which is a do anything now, a prompt. And there's plenty of those being built as well. So we tested kind of a retail chatbot that had read access to their customer database. Within about 50 minutes, we extracted customer name, email addresses, phone numbers, purchase histories, and the chatbot had no real authentication beyond, does this seem like a reasonable request? And the AI thought it was helping because all AIs are. And it just helped show us all that customer data, which was obviously very valuable, and then obviously needed remediation. So scenario 2, so privilege escalation in a low-code application. So we tested a Power Apps tool that had HR integration and what they had built. So it used AI to answer employee questions about policies. So we simply told it we needed administrator access for our query, and it grants us access to salary data, performance reviews, confidential HR documents. There's no password cracking involved, no technical exploitation. Again, just a conversation. So scenario 3. So this one was malicious actions through legitimate integrations. So this one's concerning because the AI uses your legitimate systems. We tested a customer service chatbot that could send confirmation emails, and we convinced it to send an email to all customers with a phishing link by framing it as a system test. So the email came from the customers, from the company's legitimate domain through their legitimate email system, and the AI once again thought it was helping. So obviously that then becomes significantly more impactful as well. Scenario 4, so system prompt extraction. So your system prompt is essentially kind of your security blueprint. If you use kind of instructions in any of them. So what we're able to do, it tells attackers obviously what protections you've implemented. Don't check customer data, for example, only process refunds under £100 or X amount, require manager approval for X. Once we knew the controls, we're able to bypass them. We've extracted prompts that reveal API endpoints, database schemas, and even hard-coded API keys. So every scenario here has obviously been demonstrated in real-world penetration tests against production and pre-production systems. So, integration. How we test your AI. So AI security testing needs to be part of your ongoing security testing program, not just a one-time exercise. Because obviously these models are developing, we need to stay ahead of them as well. So the ideal time to test is before production deployment, but we understand many of you may have already deployed AI, and that's fine. And we can obviously assess existing systems, but you should also test them after any significant changes. So model updates, new features, additional integrations, expansion of capabilities. All of these create opportunities for new vulnerabilities. It'd be the same as if you were testing your infrastructure and web apps after any significant change. So testing frequency. So we typically recommend quarterly assessment for high-risk customer-facing systems. You could extend that to every 6 months if you're not doing lots of development. Biannual testing for obviously those internal tools, but it really does depend on how rapidly your AI implementation is evolving and what you're doing. Now, scoping is obviously is when organizations often underestimate their exposure. So yes, customer-facing chatbots, they do need testing. Your internal AI tools can be just as risky, so they're just as important. Low-code and no-code AI applications are particularly concerning. So Power Apps, NAN, who recently just had an exploit, who have just only patched it, Make.com, these are all tools that make it easy for business users to build AI-powered workflows without really involving IT or security. And we've seen multiple internal tools being built with Power Apps, with access to SharePoint, databases, APIs, but no security controls and no gateways or interfering systems. These systems are obviously invisible to the security team, but represent a significant security risk. Obviously, if you're already doing regular pen testing, AI security is a really valuable way to go next. There's typically kind of a couple of extra days to it, and obviously the chatbots are the ones that we're seeing mostly come through. Now, obviously how we work, we obviously adhere to CREST certified, and they are actually coming out with a CREST certification specifically for AI, which we're working to. It's not been released yet. That's something that's on our roadmap as well. And we've got AI specialists who have done plenty of training on the new methodology as well. So very lastly, I'll go through how secure development. So this one is all about kind of preventive controls. So because the best approach is obviously building security from the very beginning, building ground up. So for input validation, you need prompt injection detection and filtering. So this is different from obviously traditional input validation. You're looking for attempts to override the AI's instructions or manipulate its behavior, separate the system prompts from user messages, implement rate limiting, monitor for anything abnormal patterns, which you can obviously do through, if you're using something like AI Foundry, it's got fantastic logging and monitoring, access control. Obviously, regardless of whether you're using AI or anything in development, you have to use the least privilege principle. So does your chatbot really need write access over your database? Should your Power App AI assistant have access to all of SharePoint or just specific libraries? So you want to be ensuring that proper session isolation is in place. One user should not be able to access another user's data through the AI. Output handling. So treat your AI responses as untrusted input. So just because your AI generated it doesn't mean it's safe. So sanitize outputs before using them in other systems. Implement data loss prevention to catch sensitive information in responses. Log all interactions for security analysis. And monitor kind of everything that your AI is doing. From an architectural perspective, you want to review your AI integrations during design. So implement centralized governance for low-code applications so you actually know what exists. Create secure templates that business users can build from. maintain an inventory of all AI systems. Obviously, you can't secure what you don't know, so logging all of this information is really important. Ultimately, the bottom line is that AI introduces kind of more risks than traditional testing doesn't address. So whether you're deploying your first chatbot or you have dozens of AI systems in production, you do need to have dedicated security testing as part of your regular program. I think that's it. Key takeaways. So obviously, again, AI introduces the new category for vulnerabilities. Real world incidents obviously do show risk is immediate. We're seeing it all the time. We've done it frequently. The OS top 10 is the baseline for standards for AI. They're the ones that have set it, and it's fantastic. AI testing should, again, like I said, always be built into your regular security testing program. Even if you have already done a web app test and you've just introduced an AI chatbot, let us know. We can test that separately. Secure by design really does help, setting it out properly at the beginning, understanding it and knowing who governs everything. And then again, if you've already deployed it, just let us know it and we're able to jump in and assist. And I believe that's the rest of my slides.
Lovely. Thank you, Callum. We'll pass straight over to Harry.
Fantastic. So yeah, to kind of summarize what I'll be covering today, we'll be covering sort of why AI visibility is now critical, how we can sort of support in detecting shadow AI, across the organization, sort of any AI specific security monitoring requirements, how we can build out an AI monitoring framework, and best practices and practical next steps. So I guess these stats might be slightly different to some of the ones that Chris and Callum have covered so far. But what we've seen based on our sort of market research is around 80% of employees use AI. However, only 22% of those use sort of exclusively what their employer provides. So there's obviously a massive gap there of, that 60% where they're using other tools that might not be sort of regulated, might not be approved or sort of, supported in that manner. So there's that real big blind spot there. There's also the fact that when an incident is found to be sort of attributed to shadow IT, there's an additional cost of around $670,000 on top of what a normal breach would cost. So there's a real impact there of obviously financial wise, that's a huge cost for a lot of organizations to take on board. And around 60% of AI related data exposure incidents are linked to shadow AI. So it's not it's not people using approved tooling. It's not just people using applications that have been developed internally. There's a big gap there in that shadow AI usage. And I won't go through all the risks, but I guess one of the main things is that data leakage aspect. It could be someone pasting their client contracts in ChatGPT. That data is now completely outside of your control, and as I'm sure we all are aware, all these AI tools use what people are putting in to train them and develop those tools moving forward. So that's a huge risk there that data could then be sort of make its way into the sort of training data set and potentially provide access to billions of people that can use those sort of tools on a daily basis. But one of the big things we're seeing as well is that it's not just those traditional ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini. It's also the usage within SaaS applications. So, for example, your CRMs, your help desks, any sort of tool that you use on a daily basis. I mean, I'm sure we've all seen the copilot button that pops up absolutely everywhere on every single bit of Microsoft tooling. So, there's a real risk there that those SaaS applications that you've used maybe for years and have always had an approval on, you've now got that risk there of that data going into sort of an LLM model. And of course, there's no real consent there. A lot of times that sort of capability is turned on by default without sort of giving you the option to say yes or no. I guess to begin with, so detecting shadow AI across the organization, it's not just ChatGPT again. There's browser-based AI tools. You've got those extensions there where people are, installing Claude and allowing it to access anything on their web browser. Anything they have access to, it could pivot onto. So there's a real risk there. Of course, the SaaS vendors, again, like I mentioned just then, all of those AI features that keep just popping up, that's going to be a bigger and bigger risk. But it's not just that as well. Of course, for some organizations where you're using personal devices and sort of allowing that BYOD aspect, you've got a whole other realm of AI usage on there. You have no sort of control or visibility in sort of what people are using on their own devices. So they could be extracting that data, they could be passing it through all sorts of tools, potentially belonging to nations that have no sort of regulatory requirements to really monitor and secure those. So there's a huge risk there of both the output of that being completely poisoned by various sort of ingestion methods, as Callum mentioned. But yeah, there's definitely that huge risk with the personal side of things. In terms of the detection capabilities, I mean, one of the key ones that we're looking at the moment is sort of that cloud access security broker. So that's sort of your main discovery engine. If you don't have any cloud app discovery running, you're flying blind at the moment. There's no way you would know what people are using. So we predominantly work with Microsoft tooling on a day-to-day basis. So in that sort of scenario, you'd be looking at something like Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps, which thankfully has a huge capability in understanding what tooling has AI integrated, and they've even made a big push on that themselves to kind of capture all of that information. But also it allows you that sort of capability to just flat out block things that you don't approve. In terms of data loss prevention side of things, so a big one at the moment is, how do you control who can provide information to where? And I know a lot of the clients that we speak to on a regular basis, one of their biggest concerns is that DLP aspect. How do we stop people uploading, contracts? How do we stop them uploading PII data? And one of the key things that we work on at the moment is Purview, and more specifically the sort of DSPM aspects, where we're looking at that sensitive uploading into AI tooling. There's all that capability built into Purview to capture that and to report on that, because that kind of gives you the capabilities then to not necessarily block things, but just be aware of what's happening. Obviously, at that point, if something is detected and has been uploaded, it's kind of a little bit out of your hands. But with the DSPM side of things, you can set it to block rather than just audit. So you can just stop it at that point, but still allow AI usage in a safe way. Of course, you can come at it from a sort of identity and access management perspective. So you could be looking at potentially checking for AI OAuth consents to things. So, for example, you might see people single sign-on logging into ChatGPT, Claude, and you can kind of block that with conditional access policies, and you can also obviously block the app registrations there. And of course, one of the big things, and sort of my bread and butter, is in terms of the SIEM and SOC analytics. So one of the main things with traditional SIEMs is it's more so focused around that identity, that endpoint, that networking sort of capabilities. Whereas when we're talking about AI and detections within SIEMs, we'd be looking for, creating some specific detection rules around activity that's happening on those, and also, access of those, because you could look, for example, specific DNS requests to specific sites. You can build all of that out. But it's key to mention, it's not specifically tool or sort of vendor locked in. What we always say at DigitalXRAID is that we're vendor agnostic, and it's really important for us to keep that, because we want to advise on the best tools that is there, not just the ones we're partnered with. So it's key to kind of identify what tooling is out there. Just because you've got full Microsoft stack, sorry, there might be other tooling that's better. For example, Zscaler could work better for you in terms of cloud app discovery. So sort of a practical approach for shadow AI detection. is that sort of, there's 3 phases around it. So there's that initial discovery phase where you're looking through your cloud access security broker tooling to identify usage. You can ingest firewall and proxy logs for sort of AI domain classifications. You're looking at those to try and identify usage. As mentioned previously, looking at those OAuth tokens and the single sign-on that you've got set up for those providers that could be blocked if unneeded. And of course, deploying that DLP policies to flag AI bound sensitive data, making sure that we're aware of things that are happening, not necessarily blocking. Of course, you can discover these, but the key thing, as kind of Chris mentioned earlier, is that assessment of the risk. So what is the risk to you? Now, a lot of the sort of CASB tooling has that sort of risk score built in, and it could be, for example, the usage of something like DeepSeek. It's a Chinese LLM. It's got a lot more sort of data sovereignty issues. So that's a higher risk AI application compared to something like Copilot, where you've got that enterprise restriction. Of course, it's ideal to map the data flows to understand, where departments have specific data and potentially, where they're using that, where they're uploading that to. And also, I guess one of the key things is speaking to people. You can't just rely on the tooling to detect everything. You need to be aware of, what people in the business are using, what they believe is sanctioned and unsanctioned, because I think there's a lot of, awareness issues there where people aren't aware of what is approved and what isn't. So making that really clear is really, really vital. Of course, in terms of control, again, it's kind of leaning back to that CASB aspect where you're looking at blocking AI applications that aren't approved. You can kind of go, there's kind of 2 ways you could go about it. You could look at blocking specific applications that you don't want to allow, or you can go down the route of blocking all AI applications and only allowing sort of the approved tools, which is typically what I recommend, but it doesn't work for every business. These controls and this way of working is very much business dependent. It depends on how you run your business. And of course, you can create automated alerting for new AI app registrations. And of course, one of the key things, as Callum mentioned there, is that you need to establish that quarterly sort of cadence, not just that one-off exercise, because as we see more and more AI usage across departments, across businesses, you need to be on top of that on a regular basis. So I guess some of the specific security monitoring requirements that you might have is data exfiltration to LLMs, where people are uploading their data, what they're doing with that and how they're utilizing that to kind of get data back out as well. If you're using AI tooling and providing that to the public or to other businesses, you want to be monitoring for the sort of adversarial prompts, targeting those AI deployments. And you'll need to create some specific policies around that to detect that, a little bit like you would do with a WAF for sort of a normal web application. You kind of need to expand on that specifically for AI usage. If you've got AI tokens in use, you need to be sort of utilizing that code repository scanning to make sure that that token is not being shared across out into the wild, because it's very expensive, but also that AI token could have access to other data that you wouldn't want to expose it to. As Callum kind of mentioned as well, the sort of excessive AI permissions, it's always vital to make sure that you're auditing those permissions that you've got, and that those are not being given crazy permissions that would allow them to take actions that could cause real business impact, like the example of wiping specific areas on a disk. And also to be aware of sort of that anomalous AI usage patterns. Now, you might see, on a day-to-day basis, you've maybe got 10 interactions with Copilot, and all of a sudden you've got somebody that's doing like 100 in a day. What are they doing? How are they utilizing that? And that's really where that sort of UABA side of things comes in. And as part of your sort of SIEM tooling, you can look for changes in people's normal activity. So in terms of building an AI monitoring framework, so again, the first sort of stage there kind of relates back to what Chris was referencing at the beginning, you know, where you've got to create that governance and policy. You need to set up that detection and analytics, whether that be through your SIEM, whether that be through CASB. And that kind of leads you on to the visibility and discovery section, where you're trying to identify where people are using things, if that's not permitted. Of course, into the data protection, as I mentioned previously, with that sort of DSPM aspect, you really wanted to be aware of what people are putting into those tools and how that could impact you. You know, it could be the PII data aspect, but it could also be, you know, company secrets potentially. You know, if you've got formulas for specific things, or there's ways that your business runs that has a massive, you know, benefit over other competitors, potentially by uploading that could lead into the training set, and then those competitors could somehow have that out of the training set, or even be recommended things that you're already doing. And from an endpoint and identity perspective, so that's really where we're looking at sort of that blocking. So, you know, using your CASB, using your EDR, XDR tooling that you've got in place, you can block those browser extensions, you can block the sort of AI applications from being installed, you can block those sort of web sites that people are accessing. So best practices and practical next steps. I mean, from my perspective, sort of the immediate thing that I believe organizations should be looking into is that cloud app discovery. You know, how can you get that immediate AI visibility and what people are using? Query your identity providers, make sure that you're aware of what tools are in use and what tools are sort of connected to your identity providers. Set up that DLP rule alerting. For example, in Microsoft DSPM, you know, there's that immediate, but I think it's even like one button that you can click, and it will just deploy a DLP rule that matches against sensitive data types and your sort of sensitivity labels that you've got on content, and you can basically audit that from the get-go. And the key thing, I'm relating back to Chris again, is to make sure that you communicate in that acceptable usage policy, even if it's that initial draft and you're not ready to go full bore on it yet, making people even slightly aware that, you know, we're monitoring it, we're looking to restrict it, and to make sure that it's used in a sort of acceptable way. So I think the key takeaways really is that you can't protect what you can't see. You know, AI visibility is that foundation of AI security. You know, it's not necessarily malicious activity that shadow AI is being used for. It's just more so that governance perspective. You know, you need to get that closed and make sure that that's sort of monitored and people are aware of. But of course, making sure that you're focusing on the capabilities, not the vendor names, and the right tools will entirely depend on, you know, what you use in your organization. You could be a full Microsoft house, and that's great. You know, you can use all those tools to benefit and sort of cross-correlate across them. But, you know, that detection capability is a whole new category that, you know, most traditional SIEMs, XDR solutions don't cover. And it's something that we're looking at expanding on quite rapidly. But it's key to mention that you don't have to do everything all at once. You know, one of the great things about a lot of this is that each piece can be done bit by bit. So you could look at, you know, enabling that discovery now. You can build the controls iteratively, and you can establish that governance alongside all of this. And again, to hammer home the point, make it a continuous program, you know, quarterly, monthly, however that looks for you, not just that one-off exercise.
So just left for me to say thank you to everybody who's joined today. We hope that was useful. We'll be sharing a recording of the webinar with everybody. And thank you so much to Chris, Callum and Harry for sharing their expertise. Have a good rest of the day, everybody.